right, folks. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to a celebration of this intellectual memoir by Peter Brown, all 713 pages of it, or I did, thank you. I'm not going to assume that you've all read it, but hopefully by the end you'll want to. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this event. I'm David Michelson, Associate Professor of the History of Christianity in the Department of Classical and Mediterranean Studies, and also here in Divinity School. And this event today is part of our Distinguished Lecture Series in Classical and Mediterranean Studies. But as you can see, it's not exactly a lecture. In this particular case, as I've said, Peter has already written an extensive book about his life and outlook as a historian of the transformation of the ancient world. So it would seem amiss to ask him to somehow condense or retell the book. Instead, today we have the honor of welcoming 4 other of his students. I overlapped with almost all of them at Princeton, and hearing them engage with him about the book, his method, his contributions as a historian. I'll introduce each of them just in turn as they speak. But first, how can I introduce Peter Brown to you? It seems both impossible and redundant at the same time. He is the Philip and Beulah Rollins Professor of History Emeritus at Princeton University, but also so much more than that. He's known for his books that perhaps many of you have read on Augustine of Hippo, the World of Late Antiquity, the Making of Late Antiquity, The Body and Society, Men, Women, and Sexual Renunciation in Early Christianity, The Rise of Western Christendom, and most recently a series of books on wealth and poverty in early Christianity, including Through the Eye of the Needle. But to those of us here at the table, I can say he is known perhaps chiefly as a teacher who is a model of a paideia of kindness and intellectual generosity. Knowing Peter's generosity, I can say that since many of you haven't read the whole 713-page autobiography, he wouldn't want you to be left out of today's proceedings. So Peter, ridiculously as it may be, I will attempt in 1 page of notes to summarize the general contours of your life as found in the book. The book has 99 chapters. I don't know if this has any correspondence with the 99 names of God, perhaps maybe a coincidence, but it has a similar rich and intellectually infinite qualities. It begins with Brown's family, especially the Warrens, as Protestant Irish in 19th and 20th century Dublin. And there we meet his aunts, Tida and Mai, 2 people whom Brown imagined as the intended audience for many of his books. I think a fact that explains the popular appeal and the readability of your writings, Peter. The book covers Peter's early life caught between the many poles of identity which defined Irish, English, Protestant, Catholic in the interwar period. The book also takes the reader to Sudan, where Peter's father worked, and where as a youth, Peter observed the worlds of Islam and the worlds of empire. From there, the book turns to the Shrewsbury School in Shropshire, England, where Peter entered into a lifelong occasion of learning and living as an expatriate or an emigre. It's also where Peter became or chose, we might have you tell us whether it's a choice, to be a historian rather than a classicist, something that really explains his work on the boundaries between the ancient and medieval world. From there, the book turns to Oxford and not to Trinity College Dublin, as might have been expected, where Peter was an undergraduate at New College, Oxford. Reminder for all of you except Professor Lake and Lim, New College was new in 1397. And in fact, that does explain some of the influence of Oxford on Brown as a medievalist. He's a student of Oxford of the 1950s. The book has cameo appearances by C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and to my surprise, some non-medievalist cameos. Even Billy Graham makes an appearance. This was the Oxford where Brown encountered the medieval traditions of Catholic Europe and emerging scholarship on Byzantium by Runciman, Obolensky, and others. But in this environment, Brown was an outsider, working with Tom Parker on an out-of-bounds topic, Augustine of Hippo, someone not properly classical or medieval. And one learns that Brown was almost obliged, instead of his book on Augustine, to write on a sensible topic like Cardinal John Morton of the 15th century, with all due respect to our early modern scholars who are here. Next, the book turns to All Souls College, where Brown was in the same fellowship year as Charles Taylor, and most importantly, to a world opening up to Brown, of London, of the scholarship of continental Europe, his contacts with Arnaldo Momigliano, and his discovery of a variety of old and new scholarly methods, influences ranging from Henri Marou to Evans Pritchard and Mary Douglas. The book describes in detail as well how travel, especially multiple trips to Iran, a trip to Afghanistan, and a trip to that other frontier, Berkeley, California, shaped Brown's outlook on late antiquity. Next, the book follows Brown from the Oxford idols or stresses of teaching undergraduate generalists to the professionalized schools and graduate students of Royal Holloway, Berkeley, and Princeton. That era is best known from Brown's publications, so I will only highlight three further points from that. First, it was in this period that Brown discovered the New York Review of Books, who in addition to his aunts became the focus of his writing. Again, something that I think explains his scholarship. It was in Berkeley that he encountered Michel Foucault and engaged in his work on the history of sexuality. It was in this same period that also religion, largely through encounter with Islam, reemerged both in Brown's personal life and in a reevaluation of some of his previous scholarly methods. And that brings us roughly to the 1980s when he arrived at Princeton and began to take a number of graduate students. It doesn't do justice to the whole 713 pages of his book, but I wondered if even that number, Peter, is symbolic, since it was in 713 that the Umayyads finally defeated the last of the Visigoths, and yet another transformation of the classical world occurred. Okay, that gives you the book in brief. And now to hear some reflections, we'll begin and proceed in this order here. So our first respondent is Daniel Schwartz, Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University. And he was a student under Professor Brown in Princeton from 2001 to 2009.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Let me, as the first speaker, let me thank Vanderbilt University, and I'm not actually sure who else is sponsoring this, but many thanks to all of you, and thanks to Dave for your introductions, and thank you, Peter, for writing a very engaging book. I trust it's going to be a wide-ranging and interesting conversation that I'm really looking forward to. So I'll begin. It is a daunting task to offer brief remarks on a large book that ranges from family history to biography to charting the myriad people and places that inspired thousands of pages of historical analysis. Rather than attempt to offer something resembling a review of the book, I would instead like to offer some rather idiosyncratic thoughts that stuck out to me as themes in the book. These thoughts cluster around the importance of place. Cluster around the importance of place in Peter's work as a historian. The importance of travel and movement stands out as a leitmotif of journey of the mind. Peter repeatedly returns to the role of place for shaping him as a historian, shaping the questions he asks, and shaping the historical interpretations he finds compelling. In the title that I've given to this talk, Heart-Stretching Landscapes, this phrase comes from a piece of Peter's discussion of his travels in Turkey. This heart-stretching landscapes really caught my ear. Journeys returns repeatedly to the role of place in stretching Peter and serves as an invitation to consider the role place has played in shaping each of us. Peter writes evocatively about landscapes throughout journeys. The Jordan of his childhood, studying in England, his early trips to the continent, the Pacific coast that reminded him of Ireland, thus easing his transition to Berkeley, and his extensive travels in Iran. He beautifully describes the contrast between landed Persia and the Mare Nostrum of the Roman Empire. In Peter's description, we see the power of viewing Persian Iwans, develop a sense of worship in a fire temple, and see the importance of viewing imperial reliefs in situ. Reading these portions of journeys offers me context for Peter's encouragement many years ago to travel in Syria and Lebanon, to walk Hadrian's Wall. I'll never forget his enthusiasm as he insisted we pay careful attention to the change in topography around Batman, Turkey, as we traveled from Van to Mardin. The landscape is important, it matters. Iran offers a poignant example of the importance of place to Peter and his work. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 required a shift in Peter's research agenda, not to mention its various other momentous impacts. Having lost the ability to access Iran, Peter's desire to do work comparing Rome and Persia struck him as untenable. Reading texts would be insufficient without access to the landscapes that shaped those texts, landscapes that shaped what lay within the realm of the possible for a landed empire stretching from Mesopotamia to the edge of India. Peter's engagement with the importance of place extends beyond landscapes as well. Indeed, many types of places have clearly stretched him. Prior to meeting Peter as his prospective graduate student in 2001, I thought of libraries as buildings that housed books. They landed on a spectrum of good to bad based on whether or not whether they had or could get the books I wanted. Peter introduced me to the idea, appearing often in journeys, that a library is a place with a character. We could even say a personality. The Bodleian nurtured the study of Augustine, the Ashmolean was the place for the world of late antiquity, and the Graduate Theological Union Library in Berkeley offered the right place for the study of the New Testament and early Christianity. Firestone Library at Princeton offered me an excellent place to work as a graduate student, but Peter always recommended Spear Library at Princeton Theological Seminary as the place that would have every text I might want to lay my hands on. If I recall the phrase correctly, it went something like, "Now there's a real library." Later, when I arrived for a year of study in Oxford and could look out the window of my student accommodation through the back garden and directly into the Oriental Institute Library, I knew that I was in the right place for the work I was doing. Of course, libraries only have this kind of character because they are places created by human institutions. Peter's interest in landscapes always engaged them as inhabited places, both shaped by and shaping the persons and institutions acting within them. In this way, his experiences in Iran showed him physical landscapes intertwined with imaginative landscapes of religious and political significance. These were landscapes imbued with meaning by their inhabitants. Witnessing Muslim, Zoroastrian, and Armenian Christian worship in Iran rendered the worship of God plausible to Peter in new ways. It fostered an empathy for lived religion and the power of religious ideas and communal practices to create communities. The power of lived religion is something I've always tried to keep at the forefront of my own work, no doubt due in part to Peter's example. Peter's sense of place also extends to his institutional and geographic moves. His move from Oxford to Royal Holloway inspired new ways of doing history in the realms of both teaching and research. His move to Berkeley opened to him different ways of being in the world as he engaged with colleagues who thought deeply about ethics and social responsibility in a cultural landscape marked by liberation from traditional expectations. This place was the backdrop for much of his interaction with Foucault. Berkeley and the communities that inhabited it fostered Peter's ability to imagine radically different meanings of sex and the renunciation of sex in late antiquity. In Journeys, we likewise witness Peter at tea with Mary Douglas, in London and Chicago with Arnaldo Emiliano, and at the Institute for Advanced Study with Glenn Bowersock. As much as I benefited from the holdings of the Oriental Institute Library, I know I benefited more from coffee in the basement with David Taylor, Fergus Miller, and Alison Salveson. These places of our work sustain and shape the communities that add so much meaning to that work. Peter clearly writes with genuine affection for so many of the people he has learned with over the years. At several points, we encounter Peter wrestling with the late antique ideas of the dichotomy between the body and the soul. a concept that loomed large in the ancient Mediterranean world and bears much fruit for good or for ill in the modern world as well. The title, Journeys of the Mind, suggests that Peter might have come down in favor of this kind of dichotomy, and that his autobiography would offer his reader an intellectual account of his career. While Journeys does indeed chart Peter's intellectual trajectories, it also does much more. It shows us that journeys of the mind are embodied journeys. They are shaped by heart-stretching landscapes, by places bearing the weight of the longue durée, and by networked communities of family, friends, teachers, mentors, colleagues, and indeed critics who inhabit the places we do. Peter has given us a lovely picture of how his journeys, physical, mental, social, have stretched his heart. As readers, we have the privilege of watching how a deep sense of place, both ancient and modern, have shaped Peter's scholarly habitus and the various communities that he has labored with in nurturing the field of late antiquity. Thank you.
We're gonna just hear from all four respondents, and then at that point, we'll actually offer you a brief break to bring refreshments back in here, and then we'll hear a response from Peter. So our next respondent is Ariel Lopez. He is assistant professor in the Department of Ancient and Mediterranean Studies at Rhodes College, and he was a student of Peter's at Princeton from 2002 to 2009.
Thank you. In a very interesting and entertaining book, I found the Irish section most interesting of all. I used to dismiss Professor Brown's Irish background as a mere picturesque detail, a conversation piece. How Irish could a man be who had never learned Irish and had left Ireland at 13 years old? Now I see how wrong I was. It is pretty clear that this precocious teenager took Ireland with him everywhere he went, and this includes his journeys of the mind to the ancient and medieval worlds. Professor Brown grew up in what to me is a very strange, distant world. He belonged to a social and religious group that had been made to feel homeless at home. The Protestants of Ireland had once been the British-backed ruling elite of the island. They had controlled much of the land, trade, and all the cultural institutions. They did not see themselves as only Irish, and they had given generations of their offspring to serve in the British Empire. Now, however, their villas were gone, burned by Catholic peasants. The new Irish nation-state had no place for them. It defined itself as Gaelic and Catholic, and saw the Protestants as the remnant of the British garrison in Ireland. It even attempted, unsuccessfully, to revive the moribund Irish language. The result was a dramatic demographic decline of the so-called Anglo-Irish. Protestants, such as Brown's family, became a small and anxious minority who kept their head down and only talked to each other. A mutually accepted form of apartheid divided the country. The social life and identity of Protestants was now organized around their declining churches. The result of this depressing situation has been defined as low intensity unhappiness. Yet these Protestants still control most of the cultural institutions of the country. Irish Protestants have produced an extraordinary number of internationally famous writers. Books, literature, and good writing were clearly an important part of their identity. One only has to read Professor Brown's letters to his parents to be convinced of this. Young Brown would not have been out of place among the sophists of 2nd century Asia Minor. In any case, nobody who reads about the history of Ireland in the first half of the 20th century can fail to see the connections between this world and the debates between Friend and Brown on the nature of Donatism in late Roman Africa. Issues such as religious coercion and intolerance, the relationship between ethnicity and religion, the issue of local and cosmopolitan languages, the use of violence and boycotts to intimidate your religious rivals. All of these were of more than academic importance for an Irishman. An Irish Protestant, such as Brown, is a hybrid, liminal character, a perpetual outsider. He is neither fully Irish nor fully English. Granted, he had a very privileged British education and spent years at All Souls College, mingling with the elite of Britain. Yet I get the impression that he never felt quite at home at Oxford. For all intents and purposes, he seems to have educated himself, and he seems to have met like-minded persons only when international patristic conferences brought together scholars from all over Europe. The feeling may be mutual. His work has had less influence on English scholarship than in the rest of Europe and in America, and his most outspoken critics are all English. One reason for this seems clear to me. Professor Brown has always been a profoundly religious person. Being myself of the same persuasion as Pierre Hadot and Arnaldo Momigliano, that is non-religious, I refused to accept this for a long time. But reading his memoir leaves no doubt. I do not know whether one has to be personally religious to understand ancient religion. What I do know is that Brown has a sensibility and appreciation for religious matters that is very unusual, not to say unique, among both modern and ancient historians. In his works, religion, and especially Christianity, always hold center stage. Of course, historians of Christianity are a dime a dozen. What sets Brown apart is that he studies religion in its social and cultural context in such a way that the reader always gets a total history, not a religious history. In any case, the fact remains that, more than anything else, Peter Brown is a historian of Christianization, and this made him to some degree an outsider to mainstream scholarship. It is remarkable how many of the scholars who have been highly influential on his intellectual development were deeply religious persons themselves. Norman Baines, the Baptist preacher, William Friend, ordained as a priest in his old age, there was Chitty, an Anglican clergyman, Henri Marou, the French Catholic intellectual, Mary Douglas, a conservative Catholic anthropologist, Robert Marcus, a convert to Catholicism, Claude Lepley, a Catholic admirer of Anglicanism, and many others. These are all great scholars, but none of them are among the celebrities of historical scholarship of the 20th century. Especially in the 60s and 70s of the last century, a serious historian was a social historian. He had no doubt that what he did was the right way of doing things. He engaged in high-level theoretical discussions and grandstanding declarations of what history should or should not be, all of which Brown has always avoided. In England, one also has to keep in mind the powerful legacy of Gibbon, who gave intellectual legitimacy to the polite disregard for religion that the English were taught to show. Remarkably, Gibbon is barely mentioned in this book. We do not even learn when Brown read this, the greatest of all books on the fall of the Roman Empire, nor what influence it had on him. It is all too easy to connect Brown's passion for religious history with his Irish background. As he mentioned several times, in the highly sectarian world of Ireland, his identity was simply that of a Protestant. But Brown has been a very strange Anglo-Irish Protestant, a Protestant who loves ancient and modern Catholics and Catholic things, monks and holy men, relics, ritual, sexual renunciation, Christian art, and domineering bishops. Even worse, he eventually came to also love Muslims, and, to Moses Finlay's dismay, late antique pagans. The move to Oxford as a young man seems to have triggered in him a revolt against the sectarianism of Ireland that has marked his personality ever since. He has always been uncomfortable with distinctions that imply judgments of value. He has seen it as his mission to rescue the past from the prejudices and judgment of posterity. Distinctions such as Roman versus barbarian, Christian versus pagan, Western versus Eastern, popular culture versus elite culture, high empire versus low empire, religious versus secular, even public versus private, are often regarded as suspect or misleading in his works. He is an incorrigible optimist and will always see the glass half full rather than half empty. This is true not only of the way he treats ancient individuals, groups, and historical periods as a whole, but also the way he treats his students. This leads us to the last aspect of his work I want to highlight, his anti-classicism. From a young age, Professor Brown has seen it as his goal to decenter ancient history, both chronologically and geographically. Most famously, he did this in his World of Late Antiquity, with its revolutionary Eastern emphasis. We see the same in this book. There are no loving descriptions of Mediterranean food and landscapes, of Roman ruins, or of the excitement of learning the Greek and Latin languages. He takes all of this for granted. Only incidentally, for example, do we learn that he has been in Spain. Most surprising of all, he seems to have been in no hurry to visit and revisit Rome itself. He also shows little interest in German scholars and the New Testament. I can hear an angry Moses Finlay once again complain. Brown is, quote, overlooking the core of classical civilization, unquote. I have, of course, been familiar with this side of Professor Brown's scholarship for a long time. After all, I went to Princeton to work on the history of Christian Egypt using Coptic literary texts, and I took courses in Syriac and Arabic. But I have never suspected the extent of Brown's interest in Iran and Islam, since it has left so little trace in his published work. This is perhaps the most surprising part of this book to me. His journeys to Iran loom very large in this memoir, and we learn of his truncated plan to write a history of Iran a la Brodel. I would give my right arm to have that book. Journeys of the Mind was to me a bittersweet breed. I met Professor Brown long after most of the events described in these pages. Yet the book made me think of my own past, of how I discovered his work, how I came to meet him, and the impression he made on me. As Augustine says, time takes no holiday. That clueless Argentine student who arrived in Princeton in 2002 is now dead, and I am alive. But some things I will never forget. I recall, for example, sitting in a small classroom more than 20 years ago. It was my first semester, and this was a class on purity and pollution in ancient religions, led by Professor Childs and inspired by the work of Mary Douglas. The reason I remember this particular session, however, is that Professor Brown had decided to join us and was sitting near me among other students. To my left was a certain Dan Schwartz, who was giving a presentation on eunuchs in late antiquity. As Dan started speaking, Professor Brown took out a small notebook and started anxiously taking notes. He was the only one doing so. I remember feeling shocked, almost offended. As far as I was concerned, this man literally knew everything. What was he writing down? What could he be learning from us beginners? Was his false modesty? Was he trying to teach us a lesson? No, it was none of these things. I eventually figured it out. This is who he is. He has a foolproof faith in the capacity of all humans, ancient and modern, to think for themselves. Everybody, even his first-year students, has a story to tell, and every story is worth listening to. Thank you.
Our next response, let's see, push it upward there. Yep, there we go. Our next response is from Professor Elizabeth Moodey. She is associate professor here in the Department of History of Art and Architecture, and she was a student at Princeton in 1989 to 2002.
Right across the way from Princeton's Department of Art and Archaeology is the History Department. It was quite a draw for an art historian, representing as it did real history, serious history, history without pictures. I was able to sustain this sunny ignorance because I never took a history course when I was an undergraduate. Students in the history department were understandably proud of its impressive reputation. All the undergraduates at Princeton were required to write theses, senior theses. I don't know if other departments awarded their students commemorative t-shirts on submission, but the history department did. When they had successfully put this hurdle behind them, history majors walked away with a shirt that said on the front, "My senior thesis," and on the back, "It's history." I had a seminar with Professor Grafton. That one I did register for legitimately. And because apparently no one in the administration cared, I sat in on lecture classes taught by Professor Jordan, Professor Zeman Davis, and Professor Brown, who kindly talked with me about St. Guthlac. Imagine my surprise when I found that he paid attention to works of art too. An illustrated handout for Professor Brown's History 343, explaining Carolingian feudalism, did it with drawings made after the 9th century golden psalter of St. Gall. As I said, I possessed a near perfect ignorance about what real historians did. All this high quality history teaching, even when no one was directly talking about methods, helped me put decent foundations under my own work. It was wonderful to hear so many excellent and varied approaches to historical research, and I so enjoyed being able to cross the lawn and take it all in. There is no substitute for the chance to be underfoot. The things I have most enjoyed about Peter Brown's publications and conversation also animate this most recent book. If I can talk about just three. One is his immersion in the physical world of the cultures that he studies. In Journeys of the Mind, we find numerous literal journeys. For example, when he was following the route of a 17th century Ottoman traveler in Turkey to better understand how the Ottoman Empire was superimposed over the Roman Empire in the East. We get to see, early on in his school years, this conviction about the importance of being where it happened, when one of the masters at Shrewsbury School has his students bicycling to explore medieval sites like a 13th century bishop's castle. Here was a truly distant world ruled by its own values and committed to its own sense of time and beauty. Whether we liked it or not, the modern world was flanked by a majestic presence that would not go away. We hear about his singular stint in the archives, singular, as classicists usually deal with texts but not documents. It was certainly a success, but despite the lure of intriguing 18th century documents tied together with pink tape and affixed by pins, an experience that didn't really take professionally. Linked to this sense of place is his rarer ability to visualize the past, almost as if he dreams himself there. It's more than archaeological reconstruction. It's wondering what daily circumstances might have been like for someone raised in a distant place, and using poignant details, not just to ensnare the reader, although it certainly does that, but to remind us that we are dealing with a different world. And so I liked knowing that we were introduced to the study of 15th century Burgundy by the same classic book, Johann Huizinga's Waning of the Middle Ages, with its depiction of a world equally vivid and strange to our sensibilities. Huizinga describes late medieval Flanders not by trying to convince us that its inhabitants are just like us, but by highlighting its strangeness, writing, "The modern town hardly knows silence or darkness in their purity, nor the effect of a solitary light or a single distant cry." It's brilliant scene setting, much more effective than introducing the subject with a string of dates, and an approach apparently quite different from prevailing art historical lectures at Oxford that did not look up from the archives. I can see that imagination and empathy in Peter's evocation of individual late antique lives, and thus I forgive him for describing the historical figures in the magnificent Burgundian tapestries in Bern, like eyes, with their jaunty belted jackets, sinewy legs, and pointed shoes as opulent frogs. Maybe because of that imaginative sympathy, he can see patterns running below the surface of historical developments and convey what he taps into so that we can share it. We hear how the Christianization of various regions, the way they saw change, depended on narratives that predated the transition from pagan to Christian, helping us understand how they understood, so that, as he explains, Egypt's interpretation echoes pharaonic myths as a long series of clashes between rival gods, while Armenia sees it as a Zoroastrian struggle between good and evil, and in Ireland it's down to individual characters as St. Patrick slips into the role of trickster god and outwits pagan landowners. These are enormous historical shifts, but made comprehensible because he approaches them with that sympathetic curiosity, as if a daydreamy, what must it have been like, is always hovering over drier scholarly questions. Thank you so much for writing this book, to answer questions we didn't even know enough to ask. And I have to be serious in conclusion and borrow the tribute of Pliny the Younger to his uncle, hoping it hasn't been overused because it fits this author and this book so well. For my part, I deem those blessed to whom by favor of the gods it has been granted either to do what is worth writing of or to write what is worth reading. Above measure blessed are those on whom both gifts have been conferred.
The handout that Professor Moodey referenced is, this is Peter Brown's own, handiwork. Peter, we've shared this ancient handout with them. That's our name.
1990.
From circa 1990. Okay, our final presentation is, from Professor Jelena Bogdanovic, also associate professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture. And she was a student at Princeton in the period of 2002 to 2008.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Brown, to allow us together today on occasion of your latest book. They mentioned how it is a thick book, but this is not the only thickest book. I know the needle eye is when I saw it and I purchased it at the conference, I said, okay, there is something to read. And indeed, I got this book on February 23rd. And like all architects, and I'm trained as an architect and architectural historians, what we first do, we flip the pages immediately. I took a look at the index and the table of contents, flipped a couple of pages, and then it was Friday. On Saturday, I started to read. And essentially, on Sunday, 3:44 p.m., I finished the book. It was done in one take with short breaks. I took a little naps here and there, but it was a joy after so long to read again a book by a master of the language, a master of all languages. It's written with passion and compassion. It's so much written with intellectual and personal integrity. I was reading, like all bad readers, like we are architects, I was earmarking the book just to make sure that I don't miss anything. There are a lot of earmarks. A couple of times I literally cried. It's a rare occasion nowadays to read a professional journey, intellectual journey, personal journey that is given to the others with such an open heart and with such an integrity. I remember so many meetings at Princeton with Professor Brown at Hellenic Studies, where we learned how to listen, how to ask questions, how not to ask questions, and how I really feel privileged that I had a chance to benefit from Professor's grace and humanity in person while at Princeton, and through many books. I think I purchased all of them for the library that my husband and I remade once we settled in the United States. We left our academic libraries back in Eastern Europe, hence my accent. And Dave knows when we moved back to Nashville 2 years ago, the major issue was to move 10,000 pounds of books. When the movers came, they looked at our apartment and they said, "What are you going to do with this clutter?" So eventually, the books are with us, including the latest book by Professor Brown. It's really emotional to speak how profound Professor Brown's life, long journey and wandering across the world, across different disciplines, would mark lives of so many people. I'm not an historian. I'm even on the verge with art historians as well, as initially trained as engineer of architecture, now mostly doing architecture history of medieval times in Byzantine. Hence, I'm not having any kind of an official essay, but I will just highlight a few impressions, first impressions after reading the book. I still believe in love at first sight and first impressions. And once I finished the book, what took me the most is how I realized that it was a surprise, but I realized that it was actually medieval and neo-medieval architecture that played a critical role in Professor Brown's intellectual journey and deciding to do what he did as a professional. And such a lighthearted, explicit, and simple reason about the beauty that brings in scholar into what he does is profound. It can sound simple, but it's almost religious and certainly spiritual. In my professional development, I only recently came to the terms to understand why everything that I do is always on the verge, because I'm doing mostly Byzantine, or if I'm not doing Byzantine, it's Eastern European, and it's architecture. So Byzantium didn't have Renaissance, Eastern Europe never had classical. And Professor Brown's contribution, as we have already heard, is beyond the simple discipline of either history or classical studies, moving and shifting the foci of research and allowing multiple voices to be heard at the intellectual tables. It's not easy, as we all know, and it can never be underestimated. Indeed, Professor Brown nowadays stands for latent equity. And whenever I would be outside of like a big group of people, very often it would start with pun, what latent equity can be. And Professor Brown very nicely explains in a book that he was taken by essentially German scholars in art history, because we would see, for example, everybody who knows four tetrarchs in Venice, we would see them, so they're like Roman emperors, but are they blind? Like big heads, something is out of proportion, nothing of the Roman imperial representation of the immortal Roman emperor. And it essentially started with art historians, but it was Professor Brown who managed to articulate the relevance of the period, not to be taken in pejorative terms, to be taken seriously, and to bring this at the table so that the classicists, who are always taking a little bit of pride, they're taking the core of the civilization, that the medievalists who are trying to branch inside and say, okay, we also know a little bit about what civilization means. And Ariel said very often it would be just this proposition of Christianity and religion at the ground, that we can all see that the people understand each other. It's a big contribution. But only after reading the book, I was finally convinced. I knew it. He was always medieval. Because when I was at Princeton, I would mostly do my medieval Islamic art and architecture, going up to the 16th centuries, benefiting, as I said, always from Hellenic studies conversations. But this subtlety never to reveal like in a partisan way, this is what you should believe, or this is what it is. Understanding and realizing how deeply classical Professor Brown is trained is also something that can be unsettling to someone. But this book was a final confirmation. Yes, he is medieval. So I would say another theme that captured my mind after reading the book, as they've already highlighted, it is a personal intellectual journey that is formed also at various academias in various schools. But the training at Oxford resonated the most with me, and how vividly it was brought forward. All of us who are outsiders would know most about Oxford either through short presentations there at the conferences or through the books by Tolkien and Cecil Lewis, but how vividly it was brought forward, and as as Ariel, Dan, and Elizabeth highlighted over and over again, it's not a story of history and time. It's very, very spatial. It's really about embodiment and place. It's almost architectural in a way, and this was something that I think I will reread over and over again. You mentioned Opolensky, some of you, and for me it was also revealing just to realize, okay, in the 1950s, only 2 students came to Opolensky's class. One was a Chinese female student, and the other was Professor Brown. Female Chinese student left immediately after first class, if I recall correctly, and it was Professor Brown who took the full course. So still in 2024, I don't know what to make of this, but this is something that is capturing my mind a lot. Now, a couple of you mentioned first Professor Brown's books about women and men and sexuality, but really after reading this book, I fully embraced what I also knew always, that Professor Brown is a true feminist. So very seldom we can read intellectual journey of a top scholar who would recognize mother, aunts, wives, any other women, both students and colleagues, not only as, oh, they help me with typing or they help me by cooking, but she's recognized they help me to intellectually develop who I am. And then this is like abundant credit that Professor Brown brings forward, along the fact that he is recognizing that anthropologist Mary Douglas was influential in formation of his own scholarship, along with philosopher Michel Foucault, and along of recognizing how so many female scholars didn't make it for various reasons. So once again, we can all empathize with all academics' ups and downs, practice knowledge, reading positive and negative reviews of our work with passion and commitment. But it is Peter Brown, Professor Peter Brown, who can say, and I applied for NIH grants and I didn't get them, but I did get some other grants. And ultimate joy when doing something intellectually meaningful and fulfilling. This is a really motivational book in a way as well. For me personally, the strongest impression that comes from book is the personal story about family roots, about life in Ireland, living at Oxford, living in London, moving to United States, traveling across the world, but ultimately physically leaving behind the nucleus family. And I will stop here, but Dave told us also to formulate the questions. So my question will be essentially a comment again, that it was such a joy to learn how the visual opulence of Christian architecture articulated a pivotal moment and decision to study the medieval world and its relevance today. And my question for Professor Brown will be to tell us all what is his favorite architecture.
Okay, folks, it's 5 o'clock. Professor Brown has been sitting dutifully on Zoom, which none of you have had to do for an hour. So Peter, we'll give you a 15-minute break. We don't have any food for you, so you'll lead the ascetic life. But everyone here is invited to get some refreshments, and at 5:15, Peter will give us about 20 minutes of remarks and response, and then we'll open things up for Q&A and conversation. So please don't go away, just get some food and come back. Okay, at this point, I think Peter Brown needs no further introduction. Peter, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, Dave, you can hear me, can you?
Yes, very well.
I've got the sort of sonic boom working. Dave, I really can't thank you enough for having organized this occasion. And I can't sufficiently thank you for Jelena, Elizabeth, Dan, and Ariel. That's the sort of thing you say at the beginning of any talk. But now that I've heard you, I mean it, truly. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so very much. But what I particularly appreciate was that they've given me much more than random comments or criticisms. They've given me a much more precious gift. They've actually given me back to myself. It's very easy for an author to get lost in the undergrowth of his or her work, to barrel along chapter by chapter, story by story, argument by argument, without really looking back. It gets the job done. But what one forgets is that with any major venture, at least, you do not simply write the book. In many ways, the book writes you. The preoccupations that drive you to undertake writing in the first place, that carry you through to the end, are very often too large to be seen. They emerge slowly as the book itself gets written, word by word, draft by draft, to form patterns that take one by surprise. It's like looking back over a landscape and seeing that without your fully noticing it. It is molded by low, sinuous shapes of ancient mounds. Each in their different ways, Jelena, Elizabeth, Dan, and Ariel have drawn attention to these long folds, as it were, in the landscape of thy book. Jelena, with her unfailing eye for the framing of sacred space in the architecture of Byzantine churches, brought back to me the sharp thrill of what she calls, very rightly, the visual opulence of their Western equivalents. The Gothic cloisters of Oxford, the great cathedrals of France, as I counted them as a young student. She rightly sees that the pull of such strange beauty has always kept me in half my heart a medievalist, perpetually concerned with the long-term fate of the legacy of the ancient world in the medieval West, even when the main effort of my work has drawn me to the Eastern Mediterranean and to the Middle East 1,000 years before the dreaming spires of Oxford were thought of. Elizabeth, whose work on those opulent frogs, on the exuberant miniatures of the court of Burgundy in the 15th century, and also on the supreme refinement of their other side, the grisaille illumination by which entire fairy palaces, high cathedrals lined with solemn statues, are conjured up by subtle washes of gray on gray. She has rightly highlighted to me the sheer thrill of a 16-year-old peddling for all he was worth through the country lanes of Shropshire to visit ruined abbeys that spoke, as I wrote to my parents at that time, testimony of a civilization as proud as our own, and yet so very different. Elizabeth has opened our eyes to the strange world behind the images produced in Flanders at the end of the Middle Ages. She could not have done better justice also to the sense of strangeness that falls on anyone, but especially on young students of art history, as they follow with their eyes the great sea change that led across the last centuries of the ancient world from the exquisite sculpture of the Hellenistic age to the icons of Byzantium. Dan, whose mastery of the Syriac world in what he said that heart-stretching landscapes of what are now Eastern Turkey and northern Syria, lands, alas, of refugees and violence now, but when then the crucial bridge between the Greco-Roman Mediterranean and the Syriac East. Dan has rightly seen how much I've owed as a historian to travel in foreign lands. For only through long hours on the road is it possible to sense what lay within the realm of the possible, to use Dan's words, for the great empires of East Rome and Iran, who dominate the political history of the late antique East. Grand affairs in their ideology, but slowed to the pace of a mule in the day-to-day conduct of war and government. Furthermore, his deep respect for the intricate cultural processes involved in the passing on of Christianity by preaching, by catechesis in the Greek and Syriac worlds has led him to see how much I owed to the vivid micro-landscapes of the universities in which I've studied and taught: Oxford, Royal Holloway College, Berkeley, and Princeton. Ariel, whose book on Shenoude of atrophy and the uses of poverty is a model study of the relation between religion and society in late antique Egypt, has turned his sharp eye to the modern world into which I was born and the family memories with which I grew up. He shares my own surprise, actually, at the extent to which my Irish background has determined my attitude to history and to the role of religion, both in the past and in modern Irish society. Looking back, I am indeed struck by the prominence of this particular fold in the landscape of my life. All I can say is it was not as present to me when I began to write as it became in the last stages of the book. It grew upon me as I wrote. Serendipity, I must add, played a part in this. Not everyone receives from a distant member of the family, along with a set of embarrassingly large and rather ugly pieces of Victorian furniture, an unprepossessing plastic bag, which proved to be filled with letters and documents that dated from the days of Lord Nelson, the Duke of Wellington, and the burning by the British of the White House, in which my ancestor, I'm ashamed to say, played a very vigorous part. Maybe you would be pleased to learn he departed with a load of buckshot in his leg, which I think by which he meant his ass, I think, by militia. Now, this was a temptation to undertake yet another journey into the past, which no historian could pass up. Hence the writing of the opening chapter of Journeys, where I recovered, very much with the help of my wife, Betsy, as an expert on genealogy and on early modern Britain. The deeper background of my family was one of the happiest moments in the writing of Journeys. But it was really only as I wrote those early chapters that I realized the extent to which the career of my own father and of many members of my family had been determined by the same necessities as had ruled the lives of more distant ancestors. Their careers also had followed patterns like grooves cut deep into the hard stone of Anglo-Irish society that took them always far from Ireland. As members of the Protestant gentry in Ireland, service in the wide spaces of the British Empire, and service mainly in times of war, was what gave them wealth and dignity in their native land. It was indeed in Ireland that I learned to respect the role of religion in human affairs. And as Ariel has pointed out so shrewdly, I learned it in the Irish Protestant way, by first attempting to understand the manner in which the way of life of the majority of my Catholic neighbors was penetrated by the teachings of their church. This meant that my early decision to become a historian was shaped by an acute sense of otherness not only between the present and the past, between the Middle Ages and the modern world, but also an otherness between myself and the majority of my own compatriots. Both were touched by a salutary sense of strangeness. Both presented a challenge to the heart and to the imagination, a challenge to overcome a distance, to climb real walls of prejudice and misinformation, so as to come to understand and to respect distant ages in the past, distant religious groups in the present. What I first learned in Dublin, when confronted with the massive day-to-day presence of the Catholic Church, was how to respect a major religion. I found myself later challenged to extend this respect, first to Judaism in its ancient and modern phases through the learning of Hebrew, and then more and more to Islam and to the Christianities of the East, as I gained some knowledge of Syriac, Coptic, and Ethiopic. As a scholar, I found that this is the only tried and true way to understand the role of religion in the past. As a Christian, I do not see why the effort to scale these walls of prejudice and misinformation, which every true scholar in academia must confront in his or her own way, should not also be applied alongside and outside the university to reaching out, if only now and then, to feed the hungry soul with hitherto little known or little appreciated food at the rich banquet of the Lord. These are heavy themes, all of which invite discussion, but let me end by thanking the panelists, by introducing them once again to the wider audience. Whether by design or by good fortune, they form a distinctive group. They are the Princeton crowd. They completed their dissertations at Princeton roughly around the years 2008 to 2010. Forgive me for dating you in this matter. The 2000s are well in the rear mirror now, but you came together at an important juncture in my own life. You must remember that I had handed in the manuscript of Body and Society in 1987. At that time, I'd been in America for really only 9 years, and that I'd been in Princeton for only 4. I deliberately ended journeys at that date, 1987, 10 years, that is, before the time that we came to know each other at Princeton in the late 2000s. For me, those years of the 2000s were good years. Elizabeth has caught very well, I think, the self-confidence of the history department at that juncture and its appeal to any art history graduate who might be interested in the wider context of his or her work, whether modern, medieval, or late antique. To this, one should add the energetic cross-campus networking of Dimitri Gondikas, based on the vibrant program of Hellenic studies and his unstinting support of research to every corner of the late antique world. What had been a hope on paper in the 1980s for an ever wider definition of late antiquity to cover the Mediterranean and large stretches of Africa and the Middle East had come true in part in Princeton of the late 2000s. For instance, the skills required for the study of a wider, longer late antiquity had come to be taught in many departments. I myself remember taking seminars, along with many of you, both Coptic and in Syriac, and in answer to Jelena's question, do I have a hobby? I have said at that time, I think, that my hobby was the learning of strange languages, which to enter more fully into the imaginative world of Christians from outside the bright but narrow circle of the Greco-Roman world. The experience of grappling with non-classical tongues taught me at least humility. As graduate students, some of them, if I remember well, your own good selves, and even keen undergraduates, sailed ahead of me in their mastery of Syriac weak verbs, or in their unraveling of the Coptic syntax of the great Shinute. To this, we can now add a surge of interest in more recent times in a yet more distant Christendom, the medieval kingdom of Ethiopia, where texts and practices that bore the unmistakable stamp of the late antique Christianity of Egypt and Syria flourished in strange shapes, like vigorous plants transferred to a new ecology, in monasteries perched on the top of mesas above the great Rift Valley of East Africa. An elderly emeritus, an octogent such as myself, is entitled to imagine every now and then a golden age. Though we historians, I know, are rightly encouraged not to believe in such things in the past. But the 2000s were, in many ways, my golden age at Princeton. And why was that so? I think it was because of the unpretentious bonding of us all in a common friendship, in forwarding the high venture of us all, the exploration of the ever-widening world of late antiquity. For this reason, I think that it's appropriate to end my vote of thanks to Dave and to the panelists, to Jelena, to Elizabeth, to Dan, to Ariel, with an adage from St. Augustine. It was written by him in 388, that is, at the very beginning of his career, when he was still a freelance Catholic in intellectual, planning a community of friends back in his native Auguste. It was formulated by him in this environment as a remedy for false pride, competitiveness, and blaming. I found this adjective in a small book, De la Connaissance Historique, written by the Grand Master of Augustinian Studies, Henri-Irénée Marou. Those who have read as far as chapter 31 of journeys will know how much I owed to Maru when I was a very young scholar, while still indeed an undergraduate in Oxford in 1955. It was Maru who first introduced me to the term Antiquité tardive, Spätantike, late antiquity, in his famous Retractatio, in his rereading in 1948 of his massive grand thèse, Saint-Augustin et la fin de la culture antique. It was this phrase which lingered in my mind when I first came across it, applied by Maru to the historian's craft. Nemo nisi per amicitiam cognoscitur. No one is really known except through friendship. For this act of friendship, in bringing me back to my own self, sharing with me the joy of familiarity with a distant, ever-intriguing past, I give you all my most hearty thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And at this moment, we have time for questions. Maybe I'll let our panelists go first, but we also will take some questions from the audience. Well, we have one from the audience here. I'm going to turn the camera, Peter, so you can sort of see the audience better. The mic doesn't go to Peter, so just speak loudly towards the camera.
Thank you. I'm Len Goodman, for those who don't know me, and I don't think you know me, Professor Brown, but I remember you very vividly from a visit I made to Princeton at a conference organized by Ramutada and some of the graduate students at Princeton. You spoke so beautifully, and there's one thing that you said, which I thought was lost on many of those in the room, although I think there were those present who profited from it. I certainly did. You talked about need to get inside the mind of the person that you're writing about. You talked about the need to read between the lines. And when I read the life of Augustine of Hippo, I saw a beautiful example of that in your writing, and I wanted to share it with others who may well remember it themselves. It was about the young Augustine traveling to Milan and coming up into a room where Anselm was reading. He had his back to him at first, and then as he came around, he realized that Anselm was reading, but not moving his lips. He was not pronouncing the words that he saw. And from this, you drew the recognition that this young man from North Africa had never seen something like that before. To Augustine, it was a matter of thinking and being spiritual, and not just in the body, but in the mind. But to you, it was something more. It was the recognition of how callow Augustine was at that moment, how open his mind was, how excited he was to realize something that he had never seen before, a person reading without vocalizing, without reading out loud. That kind of touch is so characteristic of your work, and I've admired all your works, as others here who know them better than I. I work on Islamic material and Jewish philosophy. I've got a new translation of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed coming out next month. But I owe a lot to that one lecture I heard from you in Princeton when I had traveled there from Hawaii, where I was then teaching, in order to hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is something which one never knows when you say something, it passes on. And certainly the joy of following Augustine in these awkward years before his conversion was one which I look back to with great excitement. And I'm very glad that you mentioned it, and that you again illustrated in your comment how important it was to maintain the awareness which you've always forwarded of the Jewish, the Islamic, and the Christian tradition in the history of thought in the Middle Ages. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Peter, if I can take the organizer's privilege to ask a question. One thing that struck me as a recurrent event in the book, but that you did not necessarily draw out and connect the line through it, is how many of the people that influenced you in the, in both senses of the word, insular world of British academia were emigres. Either emigres because of the war or because of post-war Europe, many Jewish scholars. How would you reflect on that if you were to pull that out as a theme across the book?
Oh, Dave, that's worth a whole book. And there's no doubt about it. I think, in some ways, what we're dealing with is not simply an academic influence, but also almost a topographical distribution of culture. Because it was particularly the immigrant communities, Gombrich at the Warburg Institute, Arnaldo Momigliano at University College, Carlo Dionisotti eventually, that maintained London as a sort of counterweight. To Oxford, which meant that in some ways I lived between the dreaming spires of Oxford and the London underground. This would take me from Paddington to University College in London. And I think part of the very real richness of British culture at that time came from not only from the individual refugees, but from that maintenance of a double balanced culture, an academic university culture and an urban culture, where the Jewish refugees were equally distributed between the two.
I think that we even then owe something to you, because of course, this may have been freeing or setting a pattern, of course, for yourself as an emigre then to the United States. And I mean, if we just look at this panel, my experience of Princeton was people coming from all around the world to study Byzantium, late antiquity, etc. I think it really marked something about your scholarship that you also passed on. Questions from the audience or the panelists?
I'll ask them.
Go ahead, and you can use that microphone. And again, here, I'll turn the camera so Peter can see Ariel with the question here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Ariel.
Gibbon. What about Gibbon? When did you read Gibbon?
When did I read it? Now, everybody claimed to have read. It's actually lost in a footnote in I forget which chapter in Journeys, where I actually owe my serious reading of Gibbon to my reading of the Scots Enlightenment political theory, particularly of David Hume, for the political theory lectures which I used to give at Royal Holloway College. I think there's a tendency, even for myself, to look back and somehow jump over those 3 years in Royal Holloway College in the University of London. I think they were actually very important years for me. And one of the most important was the discovery not so much of Gibbon as the late 18th century Enlightenment that Gibbon drew on. And I think I ended up with having a much greater respect for Gibbon. Gibbon was, how to put it, he was something you sort of displayed, rolled off an oraton's repentance, treated it as a work of art. It's the more I read people like Hume, or else the earlier Italian scholars such as Giannone. The more I read these people, the more I realized that Gibbon was a serious thinker, and that his decline and fall, though one might disagree with it, was based upon philosophical observation of the rise and fall of empires that stretched from his remarks in his journal about the Persian Empire right up to the time of Genghis Khan. So Gibbon, as the historian of empire, not the historian of Christianity to such an extent, but the historian of empire. This I learned in, I guess, 1973, and not much earlier. And I do owe it very much to the atmosphere of the London University, which actually took political theory and social thought much more seriously than they were taken in Oxford.
In that same lecture, you also lectured all the way to Marx, right?
Well, I didn't work it all the way. I started with Hegel.
Ah, okay.
But I gave another course of lectures which began with the prophet. Excuse me. It comes from showing off, but it was a Hebrew prophet. It was actually the prophet Isaiah, and I went from Isaiah to Marsilius of Padua. The notion of kingship and rulership in non-classical thought, that is thought about kingship, not about civic virtue. Those were the sort of things professors were slightly edged into, because they had to do something.
Other questions? I don't want to monopolize all the questions, but I have a long list. Another thing that stood out about your book was, at least the way you wrote it, with all due respect to Ariel and other talented British academics that you trained, the way that you told the story made it seem as if really it was only by coming to the United States that you began to be someone who trained graduate students and future academics in the field. To what degree is that true, and to what degree did that change your scholarly trajectory?
When we really have to use our historical sense to get an idea of how depleted graduate teaching in Oxford was. Obviously, the graduates who came there were in contact with great and learned people. There was no organized graduate teaching whatsoever, or virtually none. There was one course on medieval diplomatic, which I took and made agreeable to myself by writing forged papal bulls. of indulgences for any number of rather exotic sins. That was all. I was increasingly dissatisfied with that. I thought that the American system with professionally organized graduate seminars, I think America's debt to the German scholarship at its height in the 19th century, that struck me always as both more professional and also more wide-ranging. Because if you don't direct people to a certain degree formally through teaching in classes, they have to do it all themselves. And if you do it all themselves at the tender age at which you guys were, you usually ended up as conforming to some trend as the only thing to fall back on. And I think that the professionalization of the graduate teaching certainly appealed to me. Now, this is, I really emphasize this is what it was like in 1975. Things have changed. Non vacant tempora. Time does not take time off.
One more question from Dan here. I'll turn the camera.
I think I'm in the screen. Pete, it's more than a question. I'm curious to have your thoughts on something that I found interesting. You talk about that moment in Oxford in the 50s and a little bit later, when there's a decoupling of reading grades from service, foreign service in particular, and that you felt, if I understood correctly, you felt that kind of freed up space to read different texts and to ask different questions and to pursue different things. And I couldn't help but think in reading that goodness, there was a clear career path. And so people did it. And now when, we struggle with this in history departments all the time, and I imagine classics is similar, students want to go into things that have clear, career trajectories. And it's at least in my institution and some others that I'm familiar with, it's a real issue that we face. So it's the flip side. What you found is a liberating intellectual moment, is causing us anxiety to be decoupled now from a career path. Anyway, it was just an observation. I'd be curious to have maybe some additional thoughts on that.
Dan, it's worth a whole seminar. It is felt. It's a very big problem, which is basically how do you build academic confidence? And there was a great virtue in this very narrow but efficient socialization. You could see it in the classics department, well, not department, but the classics teachers of Oxford, that it gave them a clear run, and a run that had been there for half a century, one whole century. I used to call it the Pontius Pilate complex. It was so plainly linked with the maintenance of state power and imperial power. And it was so much against so many things which were also part of the reality of the Roman Empire. Most important of all, of course, being the fact that if you're interested in government and empire, you can end early before government and empire turn sour on you. So no classical historian, at least formally, was ever encouraged to stretch beyond the reign of the Emperor Trajan. And a friend of mine, Ferguson Miller, who was about 2 years younger than me at that time, Ferguson and I were basically united by a common contempt for that limitation. And Fergus recited to me what he had heard at a meeting of the Humaniores board, which was that the Acts of the Apostles are not history, they are only footnotes to history. And I think anyone with an interest in movements such as the rise of Christianity, such as the position of Judaism, such as the creation of a rabbinic culture, these were totally neglected. Now, this does not mean that the people who actually taught in Oxford were ignorant or uncultivated, far from it. But one has to realize that universities syllabi act as a very powerful aggregate pressure. So one has to take very carefully, fight every battle you can to make sure that certain things remain on the syllabus if you think they should be. And I think it was that loosening up, which was a product of the 50s and 60s, which actually enabled the field of late antiquity to exist in the concrete sense. That is something which people actually taught.
Well, thank you, Peter. We're at the end of our time, and it's even an hour later on the East Coast. I just want to say in conclusion something that comes out strongly in the book, which is that you were always very comfortable living in some ways as a stranger wherever you lived, and as a stranger traveling in the past, and that you taught many students to do this in a way that in the end helps us see ourselves even in a new way. And so for these journeys of the mind that you've done, we're very grateful for you having taken us along on them.
Dave, I wouldn't have taken half of these journeys without guys like you wanting to hear about them.
Thank you, everyone. Please do, if you haven't had a chance to meet the panelists, have a few more refreshments and meet them before you take off.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Ariel, Dan, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much.